So welcome everyone on behalf of REP. As I said, my name is Zsuzsanna Pató, and I would like to talk about a regulatory toolkit we developed at REP for ease the congestion on the grid. The title is Rest in Peace, First Come, First Served, and that refers to the default regime, the default European regime, which is the allocation is on a first come, first served basis for grid connections. Usually the connection is a firm connection, and usually there is one user behind a single connection point. Due to the flooding requests for transmission and distribution system operators, I think there is a need to think through this default regime and ask whether it's still tenable or not. First, a few visuals, probably you have seen this before, just showing you the amount of queue in the various jurisdictions trying to connect to the grid. This is shows you the US and some European member states. The numbers are not important. Roughly the order of magnitude is that connections are sometimes double the already existing capacity on the grid. So these are huge. These are huge even if you consider that some of the projects are so-called ghost projects, so certain projects applying at multiple locations. This is a much more detailed visual on various US states. The interesting thing you can see here, again, you see the ramp up of the cumulative queue. And you can also see that in the US, for example, there are lots of solar battery hybrids applying much more than before. This is a well-known visual in Europe, might be not so outside Europe. This is the Netherlands. And the map of Netherlands showing, whenever it's red, that there is actually no connection capacity in, let's say, 70–78% of the territory of the whole country. Interestingly, this is true for load and also for feed-in, so both ways. So this is where we are now. The question is, what can a regulator do to ease this grid congestion? So the question is, how can you enhance grid capacity? And there are, I think, roughly 3 ways to do so. So let's assume this is the existing grid capacity you have. And this is what you need. Of course, it's hard to say upfront, let's say in 4 or 10 years' time, what's going to be the needed capacity, but everyone has a plan. Each state has some plan. So let's assume you know. In most cases, not all the existing capacity had been allocated to users, so there is some remaining capacity on the grid. Might be more, might be less. So the first question for a regulator is how to allocate the remaining capacity. So this is question number 1. Then you can use the existing grids much better. I call it virtual expansion, but in fact, this is just a virtual expansion. How to make sure that the utilization of the existing assets is much better and is as easy today. And this is the second question, how to make this happen. And the third one is actually we have to build new grids. So the question is not that whether or not we do have to build new grids, but the question is how to make it as cheap as possible and as quick as possible, because the time dimension is really crucial. We have a huge gap between grid build out and those who actually want to connect to the grid. The lead time for renewables is much, much less than, for example, for a transmission or even a distribution grid. So this is question 3. And I tried to put together various options, various answers to all these questions. So I would like to go through one by one. So the first one is the allocation or reallocation of remaining grid capacities. And these examples are not just out from my head. I mean, I will show you examples, some jurisdictions already implementing or planning to implement these options, regulatory options. So the first one is managing contractual congestion. I think it's the case in many countries that users, they contract much more what they lose. So basically there is some remaining capacity is just resting there idle. Priority lanes. You know, this is directly against the first come, first served default rule. So in some countries, they realize that's not the most efficient rule. And some projects are socially more desirable or urgent than others. So they come up with regulation, creating priority lanes for these projects. And I will show you some examples. The third one is cleaning the queue. We all know that lots of the projects in the queue are ghost projects because project promoters are fishing for good locations because they don't know where capacities are on the grid. So in some countries, they kind of opened a window of opportunity for project to leave the queue without penalties. So they don't have to pay a penalty later. The fourth one, which is a real no-brainer, is to have some transparency on the available capacities. This seems like a real common sense, but in reality, in many, many countries and many regions, those who actually want to connect to the grid have no clue where capacities are, available capacities. The next one is better governance. Well, in many countries, they try to speed up the process because the licensing is cumbersome. There are various reasons for that, lots of agencies involved, lots of various timelines, and oftentimes the projects or those licensing are very, very local. So in many countries, they try to speed up in a way to arrange stakeholders and licensing organizations around a single table, and maybe not in a municipal level, but in a regional level, for example, in Holland. Of course, there are no universal solutions because each country has different environmental and also governance, state governance levels, but this is an important bottleneck for new grid builds. The next one is, again, asking the question whether the first come, first served default regime makes sense, and knowing that the connection has different value to different promoters. So an option could be to make the allocation process based on willingness to pay. And the last one, which is a very theoretical option, is in theory, you could actually trade allocated with capacities. This is very theoretical, but in Australia, the so-called grid envelopes, dynamic grid envelopes, they try to do a real-time trading with existing capacities due to the huge PV injection in Australia. Okay, some examples. So in the Netherlands now they introduce a use it or lose it thing, and many other countries in Europe are thinking about introducing such an option. Of course, it might raise legal issues because having a right for an asset which is scarce, grid connection in this case, is a valuable asset. So take it retrospectively might be legally questionable, we will see. In South Africa, for example, they give priority to shovel-ready projects. So various predefined conditions when you can qualify to shovel-ready. So they try to filter out those ones which are just theoretical, but for example, there is no license, other licenses, there is no banking loan behind it or other issues which actually you need to implement a project. In the UK, they call it a triage process, very much in line how you do it in the hospitals, so priorities. In the UK and in Spain, they predefine milestones in implementing a project idea. And if you don't meet these milestones, these are deadlines with conditions, then the grid permit can be revoked and given someone else. So it's again freeing up contracted, but likely not needing capacities. I already mentioned the amnesty to leave the grid queue. This has been implemented quite successfully in the UK and also in Brazil. In some states, they try to put some pressure on the grid operators who actually do the assessment, whether connection is feasible or not. Meeting study deadlines, this is the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues in the US. That's also linked to how the cost-sharing regime, there it's a deep cost-sharing regime, and it creates huge problems of assessing and reassessing projects, whether the grid can actually integrate them or not. And another trick is to cluster project, and this is proposed now in the US by FERC, so this is a federal rule now, and has been used in the Netherlands as well. Of course, these are just examples. I don't want to claim that other countries, they don't do the same. These are just for you to have a look if you are interested how they are implemented in the various states. And the last one is auctioning. In some countries, they try to auction, or they auction grid capacities, oftentimes linked to renewable support regime. That has been the case in Turkey and in Portugal. And in Spain, the law says that every new transmission node must be auctioned in the future. This is just an example for grid transparency. This is a hosting capacity map of Belgium by the Belgium TSO. And it shows you a vast amount of information. You can specify what kind of project you would like to connect to the transmission grid, what capacity, whether you would be willing to take some curtailment, because sometimes if you are okay with having 5 or 10% of curtailment of your injection, you might be able to connect 1 or 2 years earlier. So this is a trade-off project promoters had to assess. So these maps has been used in some countries in Europe. Some TSOs and some DSOs, they already publish and frequently update these maps. But based on the decision of the European Commission, now these maps will be mandatory all over in Europe. So the second question is the utilization of existing capacities. And here there are some quick fixes. The most widely used is the shared connection or cable pooling, when you have more users behind a single connection point. So basically, it's not the system operator doing the optimization of the grid, but those who share the single connection point. And it makes sense to couple various resources with different injection and load profiles, so you can actually increase the utilization rate of your connection point and share it. Of course, here, the parties who share the connection point, they have to make contracts among themselves and agree on the rules of how they share the connection point. The next one is setting up congestion management platforms. This has been a case in several European countries. The most well-known is the GOPAX in the Netherlands. The interesting thing there, that this is a shared platform used by the TSO and the DSOs as well. So the whole depth of the Dutch grid. It's not enough if you have a congestion management platform, if no one actually wants to use it, even those who have some flexibility. So the regulator can actually help users to explore how much flexibility they have, because they can cash revenue based on their flexibility. And in some cases, again, in the Netherlands, they actually try to mandate. So beyond a certain size, you have to participate in the congestion management. As I said, the European default regime is a firm connection contract. So everyone has been in the past applying for firm connection contract, which means that that size of the connection is available every minute and every hour. But there is a rethinking now whether that actually makes sense to have such a rigid rule. And now the European legislation is leaning towards allowing flexible non-firm connection contracts, not only as a temporary basis until the grid is built out, but also permanently. There is some innovation or reform in how system operators, they assess the available capacity of their grids, especially with regards to batteries. So in many countries, they try to simulate the actual behavior of batteries much better, because these assumptions has been very, very conservative in the past, meaning that the capacity that has been put out for use has been much less. So changing this very conservative assessment also frees up some capacities for new users. The next one is the so-called grid enhancing technologies, or some people simply call it smart grid. There are many, many technologies linked to the existing assets. You can put it on the top of the assets. These are usually digitalizing assets, oftentimes providing real-time monitoring and control of your grids. So it's a virtual extension of your grid capacities. These technologies are available commercially, almost all of them, has been used by some TSOs, many TSOs, not so much DSOs. So there is a huge potential in the future to use them more. The next one is provide incentives for network operators. Network operators are regulated entities. They are natural monopolies. So the role of the regulator is to provide incentives for them to come up with the right mix of new builds, investing into new grids, and using the existing grids better. So this is the so-called OPEX, CAPEX issue. In most countries in Europe, there is a bias to build more. And as I said, we need to build more. But on the other hand, we need to have the optimal portfolio of wire and non-wire solutions to provide the least cost service to the consumers. The next one is scarcity signals for grid users. The utilization rate of the grid changes from 1 hour to the other, maybe every 10 minutes. If the grid users have no idea what the actual scarcity on the grid is, the utilization rate, if there is grid available capacity or not, they would never respond to the scarcity of the grid. So there must be a way, usually through price and tariff, network tariff, to convey the actual state of the grid to the grid users so the utilization can improve. And the last one is the independent system operator idea. This is something to decouple the ownership of the grid from the operation of the grid for the same reasons, to have clear incentives for operation based on the least cost principle and not having a bias towards building more grids, even there are cheaper options available. So some examples, you can see shared connection has been used in many countries. Congestion management platform, these are all Europeans one. Non-firm capacity contracts has been offered now, increasingly many countries in Europe. Some incentives for network companies, we don't have lots of good examples. In Europe, I would say it's the UK and Italy who try to define output-based incentives for network companies and not simply allowing building more grids. Scarcity signals, these grid-enhancing technologies has been used in France, Italy, to some extent Germany and UK, but in many countries it's not used at all. And this is just an example of having a transmission as an asset battery storage integrated to a north-south transmission grid in Germany to ease the congestion, the north-south congestion in Germany. Of course, transmission grids, they have to comply with the N- rule. So that means if one transmission asset is out, the whole system should still operate. These big storages can actually alleviate the N- rule, because if there is an issue with one transmission grid, this storage can hold up for 3 or 4 hours until the system operator would find other solution to ease the problem of the missing link, for example, with redispatch. So basically that increases the available grid capacity. And the last one is how to build new grids. There is a lot of discussion about that, whether it's a question of money, or it's a question of licensing, or it's a question of workforce, and the question of supply chain. And these are all big problems, supply chain and workforce, especially in Europe. But there are ways the regulator can be innovative of speeding up new grids. And one idea is to allow third parties to build grid elements. I call it contestable grid build. So it's not only TSOs or DSOs allowing. The second one is try to align the grid build out, the spatial dimension of the grid build out with how we imagine new renewables would be located. And this is easy in the US with vertically integrated utilities because the same companies make these decisions. It's much more complicated in the European market model when anyone can decide on a location of a renewable facility, but the grid planning is run by the regulator and the monopolies. The next one, which seems to be again a no-brainer, but it's not implemented as much as it probably should, is to co-opting or buying in local communities. Local communities sometimes had lots of issues with new grids, and we need to find some ways to co-opt or to help these communities and offer something in exchange for having the grids. And the last one, again, in the European context, it seems to be a very far-fetched argument, but I would like to point out, if we would have much better pricing location-wise, we would be able to identify where we actually have to build new grids. And this is just an example for contestable build. This is the competitive renewable energy zones in Texas. You know, in the Northeast, those are the good locations for wind and solar. The load centers are on the other side of Texas, and they planned various routes, and actually they auctioned the build out of this transmission asset, which has been built by private parties, and the build out was really cheap compared to other build outs, and very, very quick. In 3 or 4 years, all these lines has been built. And the other one is the UK example. In the UK, if you have an offshore wind park, and you are the developer of the wind park, you have the opportunity to build the grid onshore, so from the offshore wind park, and then this grid element must be transferred later on to the public grid. And the key takeaways, well, there's nothing new. Like, we know that grids are big barriers now, and not only in Europe, but in other locations as well. The regulator has many, many options. Some are quick fixes, some are much longer term and more difficult regulatory changes. We actually have to balance what's the welfare loss due to delayed grid build out, and what's the risk of underutilized new grids, which would be translated into network tariff paid by the consumers. And I think we have to provide incentive for the system operators, because the regulator would never know which one is the best option. And I think I finish here, and I give the floor to my distinguished colleague from ENTSO-E, Nalan and Giulio, and I stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zsuzsanna, for very interesting presentation and the report. And thank you, Didart, for the opportunity to present the topic here. I will share my screen as well. So in the upcoming 20-25 minutes, me and Giulio will present you the 10-year network development plan. We will tackle the same grid topic, but from the long-term planning perspective. And I am Nalan Buyuk. I am working for the 10-year network development plan scenarios project manager. So to start with introduction, who are we? So ENTSO-E stands for European Network for Transmission System Operators for Electricity, and represents currently 36 countries, and responsible for the secure and the coordinator operation for the Europe's electricity system. And among our many interesting legally mandated tasks, today we will focus on the coordinated long-term grid planning, which is YNDP. So when we look at the 10-year network development plan, we can see it as a tool, as a study that is provided to support European Commission's selection for the project of common interest. How we are providing this support by providing the cost and benefit analyses on the projects that are submitted by the project promoters, and also an additional study that analyzes the system needs and the system gaps based on both including onshore and the offshore needs. Of course, in order to do that, we need a basis where we can put these projects and run the simulations to understand the needs, and there where we need the scenarios. That therefore this process starts with the developing scenarios, and the whole process takes 2 years time. And as you know, that as the energy system evolves super quickly, we need to again repeat the same all of the same processes in order to make sure that these 10-year network development plans and our analyses stay up to date as much as possible. So I will give an insight in the scenarios. So starting with the purpose of the scenarios, these scenarios provide the basis to develop an infrastructure that is fit for purpose, and that we know that where we do the analysis is makes sure that they are aligned with the European Green Deals. They are ensuring the energy efficiency first principle, and they are ensuring the net zero energy system. And we take the mandate from the Trans-European Network for Energy, from the regulation, and we are making this first step, developing scenarios together with the ENTSO for the gas. And we take into account the final available national energy and climate plans, and also available Commission scenarios. The last version of the scenarios has been published in this year in May. And here you can find the QR code, which would direct you to the complete package. Our website includes the report, the methodology report, the data figures, and the storyline reports that explains what are the different scenarios. This being said, we already started to, once after we finalizing the publishing the draft scenario report, we call it draft because it's will be still approved and commented by the Commission before we make it finalized. But meanwhile, we already started 2026 scenarios as well. And these scenarios are the results of the extensive stakeholder engagement, especially how we develop the input parameters that are coming outside of national energy climate plans, and also the methodologies that how we run the scenarios for, especially while planning the optimization and the sector integration, and optimize the demand and supply. And we hold a number of webinars, workshops, public consultations, and stakeholder roundtables to make sure that we get the stakeholders' comments, and if we are blinded in any way, we get in the information received from the stakeholders into account before we finalize our methodologies. And we have our own independent stakeholder reference group that is mandated by the ACER's framework guideline, which we are working quite closely. And we make sure that we ensure the transparency by publishing reports, availability of input and output data sets, and the visualization tools. So as there are new, we are still already working on the new scenario cycle. Don't hesitate to check the main website to see what are the next steps, or join our newsletter so that you will be informed and have your say for the scenarios as well. I will give you here just some examples and two of the main messages coming from the scenario report without going too much in the details. Because it will be more detailed in the reports itself. So one of the most important high-level messages that we have is that energy efficiency is key step to achieve EU climate and energy objectives. We see that the final energy demand is declining, considering the reference year in 2030 and 2050, even in the further scale. And on the other slide, we see that despite the reduce on the final energy demand, we see an increase in the direct electricity demand. And it's showed itself that the direct electricity is most efficient solution to achieve these energy and climate targets. Also, one of the other important element is that the consumer behavior adaptation, so active participation and the behavioral adaptation. And of course, another efficiency improvement of the existing technologies and development of the emerging technologies, which are more energy efficient and helps decarbonizing the system. And also one of the core important elements here is the sector integration, so that we can analyze better the system where the system can integrate to provide better efficiency and also enable the further and best integration of the hydrogen system. So this is one of the reasons that why we conduct this also study together with the ENTSO-E, so that to combine the electricity and gas and the hydrogen part to have this system in an integrated way. In the other slide, we will look into the supply part. We see the change in the also the EU supply mix, where we see that when we look from the historic data sets, we see its solar and wind generation increases remarkable growth. And here we see that in 2030 already threefold, and in 2050 approximately ninefold. And one of the other important thing is that the natural gas supply phased out by 2050. So in the 2050, we see that there are still low carbon sources like nuclear and blue hydrogen supporting, continue to support the decarbonized energy system. So here for the identification of the system needs and the offshore network development plan, I will hand over to my colleague, Giulio.
Nalan, you will continue presenting. So thank you very much, Nalan. My name is Giulio Pera, and I'm the TYNDP project manager. So now we have the basis of the scenarios which identify the different pathways for achieving the decarbonization targets across Europe. So we have this basis to assess the projects, and the identification of system needs. In the previous slides you have seen there's 5 steps. In the TYNDP scenario is the first one. The second one is ONDP, Offshore Network Development Plan, and IOSN, the identification of system needs. These are 2 key components of the TYNDP developed by ENTSO-E. The process evaluates and identifies the long-term system needs of Europe electricity grid to ensure reliable and sustainable electricity transmission across borders. Through the IOSN and ONDP, ENTSO-E provides guidance on the necessary infrastructure investments to meet the EU climate and energy goals, supporting the cross-border cooperation and the grid expansion projects. In these slides, you can see the different candidates that we give to the optimizer. So to address tomorrow's challenges, we will require the parallel development of different ranges of solutions. So you can see non-infrastructure solutions, but you can also see electricity infrastructure solutions. If we can go to the next slide here, you have an overview of the study process. So we start with the input. So we collect the starting grid, the investment candidates, and then we have the Pan-European Market Modeling Database. It's another acronym for today, which contains all the information of the generators across Europe. We plug everything together, and then we have the optimization done into Antares. And then what we get is the needs in 2030 and 2040. Then the next slides, we can see what the output looks like. On the left side, you see the opportunities for the increase in cross-border transmission and storage, as well as peaking units capacity in 2040. So with the arrows, you see the cross-border, and then you see in yellow, in the different shades of yellow, you see the needs in terms of storage. And on the other side, you see the priority corridors defined by the TANI for the offshore grid expansion for the different sea basins. In the next slides, we see what this means in terms of benefits for Europe. So on one side, we have what happens if we stopped investing in the power system in 2025. So what will the energy bill look like? They will be rising to 132 billion euros per year. We would have more system instabilities and risk of blackouts with increasing renewable energy curtailment every year. We would depend more on gas and gas-based generation. So we can see on the other side of the slide what actually what happens if we do invest and we address system needs. So with investing 6 billion euros per year, we would cut generation costs by 9 billion each year. We would ensure stability of the system, and we would avoid curtailment for 42 terawatt hours of renewable energy per year. These figures comes from TUNDP 2022. The 2024 is running at the moment and should be out by the end of the year. In the next slide, we can see the approach of the ONDP that for this cycle has run separately from the identification of system needs because of time constraints. By regulation, we were mandated to publish the offshore network development plan by the 25th of January 2024, so it was not fitting within the timeline of the regular TUNDP, which takes 2 years from starting scenarios to delivering the cost-benefit analysis and the needs assessments. So for this cycle, it was a separate exercise. In the next cycle, it would be all integrated into one study. In this schematic visualization, you see the 4 steps: creating the starting grid, identifying which expansion candidates do we have, then we have the linear optimization, and then we have post-processing in the regional groups. It's very similar to what is being done in the IOSN. The base of the study, obviously, and we see it in the next slide, is the offshore. Can we go one slide ahead? Right, yes. So we have radial offshore, but we also have hybrid offshore. And what is it? Basically, the offshore hybrid refers to this infrastructure that has dual purpose projects. So they serve both as generation, but also as interconnector. And when we go into multi-purpose, then we add a layer of cross-sector dimension. So we are connecting both bidding zones, and we are also connecting generation. What stays outside of the scope is the generation assets. We are only looking at the transmission side expansion. We give it as an input there. And in the next slides, we will see a bit of the results of the offshore network development plan. So as I was mentioning, there's radial connections, but there's also hybrid interconnections, and 1 out of 7 gigawatts will be connected by offshore hybrid corridors. So we see that in 2050, hybrid corridors will progressively grow to link up to 14% of the offshore renewable energy sources. In these slides, you can see, you can say, yes, you see the corridors identified by the ONDP, but you also can see the potential corridors with a dotted line, and the existing ones are in green. In the next slide, we have you can understand the speed we need to achieve these ambitious goals. So today we only have 7% of offshore renewable energy sources foreseen in 2050. So from 34 gigawatts, we will have to go up to 496 gigawatts. So it's a huge increase. This is basically 2.5 gigawatt per year. Sorry, this in the last year, to give you a comparison, in the last 10 years, we have increased by 2.5 gigawatt hour per year. And if you see in the graph above, we will need at least 10 times that for the next 30 years. Next slide. Here you see the differentiation between radial projects and hybrid projects and how they will be connected. Most of the offshore will be radially connected, but you can see also there's a differentiation between existing radial that are planned to become hybrid projects, and then what is hybrid needs identified in the offshore network development plan. In the next slide, okay, so this, let's say, finalizes the needs exercise. What happens next in the TYNDP process is we ask project promoters to submit projects in the TYNDP. So these are real projects. They have different levels of maturity. They can go from under consideration to under construction. This happens every 2 years, and this is our website. You can go and explore the different projects that were submitted in TYNDP 2024, which we are currently assessing for the cost-benefit analysis. If we go to the next slide, we can see how they are split between the different technologies. You see most of them are transmission lines, but we also have investments in substations, phase shift transformers, compensation devices, and others. Together with transmission, we have also storage projects that are presented. These are pump hydro technologies, compressed air energy, and electrochemical storages. So what we do is we take these projects and we assess them on 11 indicators, which we see in the next slide. These go from the social economic welfare to CO2 reduction, but also we look at grid losses and congestion relief. There's also res integration, which is a very important one. So once we compute all these indicators, both the market ones, which you see on the left, and you also have the network indicators, we then give this to the European Commission, which then starts the process for the project of common interests and projects of mutual interest. And I think this is the last slide from my side.